Struggle in Progress, a conversation on Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. I'm Sara Lomax-Reese, the president and CEO of WURD, and I'm so happy for us to be together tonight. This is a really auspicious night. I'm a little out of breath because Aaron, the rapping professor, tossed it to me when I was back there. Because we are broadcasting live, as you can see. So I want people to know that, because when we get to the Q&A part of the program, I want you to know that you are not just talking to the people in this room or on this stage, you're talking to the world, okay? So just keep that in mind. We have an amazing program for you tonight. It's like a whole multimedia kind of experience. And we're gonna have this really dynamic panel discussion, and then you can go upstairs to an amazing world premiere of Ruth Naomi Floyd's Frederick Douglass Jazz Works. And if anybody has ever heard Ruth Naomi Floyd sing, I mean, it is a real spiritual experience. So I hope everyone will stay and go upstairs and continue to enjoy and be nourished and emboldened by this experience. I just wanted to say a few words about my father, whose name this series is named for. Walter P. Lomax Jr., MD, is the founder of WURD, and he was a physician, he was a philanthropist, and he was an incredible entrepreneur. And he loved history. He loved Black history. And so I know that he is going to be guiding me as I guide this conversation tonight, because he would be right there. He would be sitting right front and center, because he came to all the WURD events, everything, when he was with us. So I'm waiting for my mother to show up. If you're listening, Mom, come on. You know, I got you a seat right up front. But it's really wonderful to see so many people here, and I would just add that we're expecting a really full house. It's just 5:30, and there's a lot of people here already. So if you could kind of just scooch in, so if people come, they can fill in from the sides as opposed to having to climb over people, that would be really, really great. Right now, I'm gonna ask Kathleen Greene from the Barnes to give you greetings. And Kathleen is the curator of public programs here at the Barnes, and she's like our partner in crime, because when we do these events, it's always wonderful to work with Kathleen and the entire Barnes team. So, Kathleen?
On behalf of the Barnes Foundation, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We are thrilled to continue our partnership both with Sara Lomax-Reese and with the WURD community. Tonight, on every first Friday, we have collection access and a concert upstairs that goes from 6 till 9 o'clock. And tonight, we are really fortunate to also have the exhibition, the 10th anniversary exhibition of 30 Americans. It's a major exhibition drawn from the acclaimed Rubel family collection and features many of the most important and influential African-American artists of the past 4 decades. This exhibition will be on view through January 12th, 2020. The exhibition features 30 artists who changed the way we think about contemporary art, including Jean-Michel Basquiat, Mark Brangford, Nick Cave, Barclay Hendricks, Carrie James Marshall, Wengechi Mutu, Lorena Simpson, Micheline Thomas, Kara Walker, Carrie Mae Weems, and of course, Kehinde Wiley. From the canonical to the cutting edge, the featured artists explore issues of personal and cultural identity against a backdrop of pervasive stereotyping of race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, class, always addressing intersectional politics in unique and powerful ways. The Barnes Foundation presents, for the first time, 30 Americans being shown in the northeastern US since 2011, when it was on view at the Corcoran Gallery of Art in Washington, DC. That is actually where President Barack Obama went and saw Kehinde Wiley and why he asked him to do his portrait. After tonight's discussion, please make sure to head upstairs to the court to explore the exhibition and to enjoy the artwork of the Barnes Foundation, as well as the sounds of vocalist, composer, and amazingly wonderful person, Ruth Naomi Floyd. She has created an ensemble of musicians and artists to create a suite of music honoring the legacy of the famed abolitionist and statesman Frederick Douglass. And that is, of course, where we came up with the concept for tonight's theme. Her original compositions are paired with the words from Frederick Douglass's landmark speeches, addressing the tragedy, grief, injustice of American slavery through a prism of hope, perseverance, and triumph. Tonight's performance, as Sara said, is the world premiere of Frederick Douglass Jazz Works, and the second set starts upstairs at 7:30. So we look forward to seeing you upstairs, and I'm going to turn things back over to Sara. Thank you.
We're going to have a artistic presentation, poem, spoken word presentation by Janine Kayombe. So, here you go.
Hello, blessings. How's everyone doing today? Super honored to be in this space, and if I can get the permission from my elders, I would like to begin. I see a couple head nods. We good. So this piece today was written while I was driving down the Underground Railroad on the way to Preston, Maryland, to Harriet's ancestral land. There's one of the largest trees within 400 miles there. It's a poplar tree. I believe it's the one that Nina sang about, but that's still up for debate. This land that I was honored to go to is held by two Black queer elders, Aunt Donna, Aunt Deborah, and they have made a space for younger people like myself to walk barefoot on the same land and to bathe in the same creek as Harriet. Oh, for the radio. Okay, it's gonna mess up my... Harriet low with the shotgun swinging, crossing the chop tank and she ain't fishing. Feet bare and eyes wide and she ain't tripping. Over rocks to pop Glocks and save them children. Moving logs and hopscotch, running the Mason-Dixon, fixing her sawed-off 12 gauges being christened. Constellations glisten like a whole family again. Alignment means time spent. She was a general to twice the men that wish death upon she. She walk in the darkness and still can see. 30 knee deep in a marsh, her compass was tree bark. The tobacco that she sparked was mesquite and harsh. Best believe she was a mark. Harriet low with the shotgun swinging, crossing the chop tank and she ain't fishing. Feet bare and eyes wide and she ain't tripping. Over rocks to pop Glocks and save them children. Moving logs and hopscotch, running the Mason-Dixon, fixing a sawed-off, 12 gauges being christened. Thank you.
All right, let me invite our esteemed panelists to the stage. So as Erica Armstrong Dunbar makes her way and Dr. C. James Troutman makes his way, I'll give their, you can sit wherever you want, I'll give their bios. We've got, this is easy because we got one woman and one man.
I did the girl, yes.
Girl, boy, girl, boy. So,
Girl, boy, girl, boy.
Dr. Erica Armstrong Dunbar is the Charles and Mary Beard Professor of History at Rutgers University. Her first book, A Fragile Freedom, African American Women and Emancipation in the Antebellum City, was published by Yale University Press in 2008. Her second book, Never Caught, The Washingtons' Relentless Pursuit of Their Runaway Slave, Ona Judge, was a 2017 finalist for the National Book Award in Nonfiction and a winner of the 2018 Frederick Douglass Book Prize. Ashe. And I totally forgot about why she's here. She is the author of the new, it hasn't even hit the streets yet, it's coming out on November 5th. She Came to Slay, The Life and Times of Harriet Tubman. So this is like hot off the press, and we've got a little special deal for you, which I'll tell you at the end of the program. But yes, she is maybe, yes, the first African-American woman biographer of Harriet Tubman. Maybe, yes?
Probably, yes.
Probably, yes. We're claiming it.
We're gonna
She
claim
is.
it, yes.
She is. And next to me is Dr. C. James Trotman. He said I could call him Jim, so don't everybody look at me side-eye when I call him Jim. Dr. C. James Trotman is Professor Emeritus of English and founding director of the Frederick Douglass Institute in 1995 at Westchester University. He is also the founding convener in 1999 of the Douglass Institutes on the 14 campuses of Pennsylvania's state system of higher education. He earned his undergraduate and master's degrees from Penn State University and his doctorate from Teachers College, Columbia University. He is a biographer of Frederick Douglass in 2011, and the author and editor of 3 books of literary criticism and numerous articles in African American and American studies. His most recent publications include an analysis of Douglass's speeches in the 2018 issue of Rhetoric Review and the inaugural lecture of the Westchester University Douglass Institute de Baptiste, published in the Boulay Journal in 2019. And professionally, Dr. Troutman currently serves as a commissioner on the 2018 National Frederick Douglass Bicentennial Commission. He is also finishing a biography of Matthew Anderson, the founder of the Berean Presbyterian Church in 1889, the Berean Bank in 1884, and the Berean Institute in 1899 of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So we want to welcome both of our panelists, Dr. Erica Armstrong Dunbar and Dr. C. James Trotman. So thank you both so much. Really excited for this conversation. This is like game day. I've been ready for this for a few weeks now, and so I'm happy it's here. Tonight is really, like I was saying earlier, really auspicious because the Harriet Tubman movie comes out today. We didn't really plan it this way either. And it's the world premiere of Ruth Naomi Floyd's Frederick Douglass Jazz Works. And so we're here to talk about these 2 amazing figures who we often don't talk about in the same, like around their relationship, around how they existed at a time and space when they were both freedom fighters in different ways, but advancing the liberation of Black people. But I want to start to see if each of you could kind of speak into your specific work. And I'll start with you, Dr. Trotman. What inspired you to create the Frederick Douglass Institute? It's at 14 universities in Pennsylvania, and I'm just wondering, like, what was the inspiration for that work?
I like punishment. The fact of the matter is that Mr. Douglass always worked in the classroom for me. It didn't matter whether it was prisoners, junior high school students, college level or graduate students. Douglass's works always resonated with my students, largely because he presented his own vulnerabilities. He talked about why it was difficult to think, why it was difficult to relate to others, what it was like to doubt and to have that self-doubt resonate through your life. So let me just give you 3 dates in order to answer the question about how all of this got started beyond the classroom. The first date is February 1, 1895. The second date is October 12 of 1995. The third date is October 1 of 2013. Those 3 dates are monumental in this very brief sketch. On February 1, 1895, Mr. Douglass gave his last public lecture on the campus of Westchester University. And the students discovered that from an assignment I gave them from my class. It was not only the discovery of that particular event, but we went on to discover that Mr. Douglass gave not only his last public lecture, but that he had been in Westchester every decade after his escape from slavery in 1838. And we can talk about why Westchester in the Q&A. The second date, October 12 of 1994, is the date when we sponsored a full academic conference in which more than 80 scholars from around the country and the world came to celebrate the centennial of Mr. Douglass's life. And that opened the door for us to establish an institute, and from that institute that worked well at Westchester, we were then able to take that entire apparatus, if you will, to the other 13 colleges and the other 13 universities in the state system. So no matter where you are in Pennsylvania, if you're close to one of our campuses, you will find a Douglass Institute there in one degree or another. The third date, October 1, of 2013, is the date when we unveiled a full human-size sculpture of Douglass on our campus, done by the distinguished sculptor Richard Blake, who also happened to be a member of the faculty. And it adds to what is now popularly understood, that this man you know as Frederick Douglass, whose real name was not Frederick Douglass, any more than Harriet's full name was Harriet.
What was his real name?
Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. We can get into that as well a little later on, but in any event, the point to be made about our sculpture is to encourage you to come and see it. The second part is for you to know that Frederick Douglass is the most photographed American in the 19th century. Not just African American, the most photographed American. And we can talk about how all of that developed as well. So how did all of this get started? It remained a classroom initiative that I felt, along with the other members of my team, would be a subject that would work on any campus, anywhere. And that's how we got started, and that's how it continues to go, because Douglass is not a dead end for anybody. He's a beginning in much the same way as the study of Tubman is as well.
And I just want to hold up Dr. Troutman's book, and he is a Frederick Douglass biographer as well. And so, you guys we need to support our scholars and our authors. So just wanted to put a little plug in there.
Thank you.
I want to turn to you, Erica. So you wrote this incredibly successful book that preceded this She Came to Slay biography. It was called Never Caught, and it was about the life of Ona Judge, who was an enslaved woman under the George Washington's household here in Philadelphia, and she escaped and was never caught, and you can talk about that way better than I can. But my question is, she was a figure that was not known at all by anyone, really, until you really brought her to life. Conversely, Harriet Tubman is someone who everybody thinks they know about, and her name is just like, her and Frederick Douglass are two of the most widely known African-American, freedom fighters that we don't really know that much about, but we know their names. So I want to see if you could talk about how your experience was different in writing this Harriet Tubman biography versus the Ona Judge story, and what you learned about Harriet Tubman in this process that you did not know before.
Yeah, no. Well, first, let me just thank you, Sara, for convening all of us this evening. Thank you to WURD and to the Barnes Foundation for allowing us to spend time on November 1st, on the day that the feature film Harriet is released nationwide. And I said something on social media today that today's a good day for Black women's history. And so it's only, I think, fitting that I'm here in my home city with WURD talking about just that, about Black women's history, about Black history in general. And yeah, the writing, so this book that's coming out on Tuesday, She Came to Slay, was a very different project. Thank you for holding up the book, Sara.
I'm a marketer at heart.
It was a very different project than the book that I wrote previously, Never Caught. Never Caught was something that I had worked on for almost a decade before it was published. And it was a project that allowed me to stay true to who I am as a scholar, which is to think about Black women's experiences in the 18th and 19th century. I'm a scholar of Black women's history. That's what I do, that's who I am, that's what I claim. And so really writing about Ona Judge was writing about fugitivity, what it meant to be a fugitive, to think about living in the shadows, not able to really sort of understand, experience freedom. So my editor came to me and asked me, would I be interested, we knew that the film was coming out this November, would I be interested in writing a sort of shorter, accessible biography of Tubman as someone who sort of was a specialist in fugitive Black women? And I thought about it, and I'll admit, at first it was a little daunting. I've taught Tubman for a long time. There are multiple biographies of her, most of them written by white women. And I paused for a moment, and I didn't agree to write the book until I felt as though I could add something different, something new. And one would ask themselves, well, we all know Tubman. What's new about Tubman? And I thought, well, we haven't really heard Tubman through the lens of a Black woman scholar. And that it was time to make that accessible and public, but also to bring Harriet Tubman into the 21st century. And to modernize her, to think about her. We all think we know Tubman from that quarter of the textbook page from your high school history book, or your Sunday school class, or your Black History Month program with church. And while all of those moments are important and introduce us to someone who we all should know, we all really know very little about her. My son, who's 15, he was showing me this little thing, this app called TikTok. I don't know if you all have heard, is this one of these little, okay, I'll stop. But one of these other little apps where they take little movies or what have you, and there was a TikTok, supposedly, of there's someone with a camera going around the campus of Harvard University. That's what they said. I did not see a sign that said Harvard, but that's what it was said. And they had a picture of Harriet Tubman. And they were going around to students, they looked fairly young, so perhaps first and second year students, asking them, who's this woman? Nobody knew. Rosa Parks? Rosa Parks like 5 times. But when you said the name, no, it's Harriet Tubman. Oh, yes, we know Harriet Tubman. Do you really know Harriet Tubman? What we know, or what is sort of talked about, is her experience emancipating herself and then spending nearly a decade as a sort of conductor on the Underground Railroad. And those experiences are super important, but really they only capture about a decade of her life. And Tubman lived until she was about 91 years old. So one of the things I wanted to do in my book was to help us think about Tubman not only as that person on the Underground Railroad, not only as the sort of image that we have of her, elderly, head covered, hands clasped, but that Tubman was much more than that. Who was she as a child? Who was Araminta Ross? Her name, her given name when she was born. Who was she as a child? Who was she as a teenager? As a newlywed under slavery? Who was she as a Civil War hero? Who was she in the 50 years after the Civil War? What was her life like? How did she contribute? How did she maintain the status of a sort of social justice warrior? Because she did just that. So I made the decision to write the book when I felt as though I could answer those questions and to do it in a way that added significant Black girl magic.
All right, then. Yeah. So I want to jump into this, this space of where their lives overlapped, or how if they knew each other, how Douglass and Tubman knew each other. I know, based on, the research, that, they both knew and interacted with John Brown. He was trying to recruit them both to be like, yo, let's do this. Let's get a serious revolt going. And they responded differently. Tubman and Douglass responded differently. They were both committed to women's suffrage. They were both active in the Civil War. So can you talk, and I'll start with you, Dr. Trotman, can you talk a little bit about their relationship, the Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman relationship?
Douglass, for all of his life, walked shoulder to shoulder with women and their rights. Long before the vocabulary of women's rights came into our common understanding. The first Harriet in his life was his mother. And through the whispers and hushes and the secret conversations that took place on the plantation, the Y Plantation, on the eastern shores of Maryland, Douglass learned not only to love women as people, but also to listen to their wisdom. And so when she escaped from freedom, Douglass understood that this escape for freedom drove her to a place where he himself was. And that place was to not only find freedom for yourself politically, but also to find freedom for others. And this brings us to really one of the big words of the 19th century, and that is abolitionism. That movement spearheaded and gave context to much of what Douglass did, and it was the meeting space, if you will, conceptually, where Douglass and Tubman came together. Surely there is enough evidence to talk about Douglass and Tubman having met in Rochester, because Rochester was so close to Canada, and Douglass lived there for almost the longest period of time he lived in any one house. And the record indicates that she was shepherding, if you will, guiding slaves, and that at one point they had to stay at Douglass's house in Rochester. They also met in Philadelphia, and I don't want to get ahead of your questions, but part of that had to do with the 100 conventions Philadelphia as the cradle of the largest number of free black people in the country, was very active, from William Still to Robert Purvis, to all of these men and women who together helped to give substance to the free African society. And for those of you who are looking for starting points for the development of black consciousness in colonial America, just before Douglass's time and afterwards, look at the Free African Society. It was the Salvation Army. It was the bank if you needed money. It was the resource for how do you get out of here. I want to move. I want to take care of my family. So that was one of the additional intersections. And then, of course, in terms of Douglass's respect for Tubman, he wrote a beautiful letter to her when one of the white women in the abolitionist movement was going to write a book about her. And he remarked that, you know, I've been public for a long time, but you've been working in the dark, in secret places. And we could hold a whole seminar on what that darkness meant, from not only the North Star and reading all of those calibrations to the disguises. And then, of course, I don't need to remind you, but in Bristol, PA, there is an absolutely fabulous statue of Harriet Tubman with those guns. And she meant business, and Douglass understood that. But I think it's important to add that we're not talking about people who were in the chorus of freedom fighters. Douglass and Tubman were soloists, singular voices who can't be duplicated by anybody. She had much to do with, I think, motivating Douglass to continue to struggle in public with the political as well as with the other members of the abolitionist party, who frequently went head to head with him over the things that he wanted to do. So Tubman was a source of inspiration. They met at various places, and John Brown is a critical figure in all of this. And please take time to reconsider John Brown. Douglass did so in 2 speeches. He said, you know, we call John Brown crazy, but that's because we haven't thought more deeply about what John Brown was doing. The real craziness, Douglass said, was slavery itself. That was the craziness. So he understood the value of Tubman's role in providing a context for this movement. And a couple of quick things. One is that it really doesn't matter how many persons Tubman led to slavery. I mean, it's helpful in 70, 700, whatever the case may be. But she broke the myth, the bad myth, that slaves did not want to be free. And every idea that is a good idea moves humanity forward. And she, along with Douglass in his own way, made that myth a palpable expression of the times by reminding those who were enslaved that I hear you, I know you want to be free, and I'm doing all that I can in my own way to make certain that that freedom becomes real to you. So the point to be made is that Douglass and Tubman interacted. They knew about one another. He sent her essentially a love letter, and I think it's 1848, in which he said, I know your work, I respect your work, it's essential work. So they were very close in the struggle, if you will. And it makes for a very fascinating story about these two singular voices, not only in our history and women's history and black people's history, but in world history.
So I want to bring Erica into this question and this conversation, but you can go wherever you want on this, obviously. And this is really meant to be a conversation, so much rich history here. But I want to, 2020 is the 100th anniversary of the women's right to vote and this whole notion of women's suffrage. And we're also in kind of this Me Too, this Me Too kind of time. And I'm curious, the way you describe Harriet Tubman and the way people have said the movie is that Harriet Tubman is like an action hero. And the way she is described in the book is she's like fierce. I mean, she is incredibly courageous. She's carrying a gun. She is not taking any stuff. She's incredibly strong and powerful, even though she's small in stature. And so I'm wondering if you could speak to what her views were on like black women's rights and equality in that moment, and anything else you want to speak to in terms of the relationship between Douglass and
that's a great question. I think it feeds into the first question that Dr. Troutman just answered. I think that when we think about Tubman and Douglass, both spending significant amount of time on the eastern shore of Maryland, also being contemporaries, right? They were contemporaries and were engaged in helping fugitives. We know that. But I want us to take a moment to think about slavery and gender and what gave Douglass the ability to have the platform that he had, as opposed to someone like Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman never, unlike Douglass, she wasn't literate. She wasn't someone known for sort of gracing the stage. She spoke at multiple events for women's rights, for the sort of anti-slavery crusade, but she was much more interested in being not in the spotlight, which sort of made sense because she was a fugitive until 1864, right? So when we think about it, right? So even when Tubman goes down to South Carolina and she's participating in the war, she's recruited eventually to go down to be a spy and a scout. She is still technically a fugitive. So she's going down and working for the Union, but because she hailed from the state of Maryland, Maryland had not set anybody free. And so she went as someone who was still technically enslaved, doing the work, right? Tubman was interested in the work. She was interested in the work with John Brown. She raised money for Brown. She communicated with him frequently. He went to Canada to spend time with her and recognize that she had the ability to recruit people, recently self-emancipated folks, those who were fugitives who'd fled to Canada, to get them to come and to participate in what was going to be, according to Brown, a revolution. We know what that turned out to be. She never really turned her back on Brown, ever. She was in New England trying to collect money for him and she was ill when the raid happened on Harper's Ferry. She never said no to Brown because she believed, she knew that it would take a war to end slavery. She didn't know what that war was going to look like. She thought Brown might be the person who created or started that war, but she knew that it would have to be something of that magnitude. She worked behind the scenes. And so this note that Douglass wrote to her biographer. We call her a biographer, but she was really the person, her name was Sara Bradford, who sat down and did interviews with Tubman to tell her life story, right? Because we know Tubman could not read or write. And she produced something called Scenes in the Life of Harriet Tubman. It first published in 1869 and then multiple times thereafter. And it was kind of a bad job, just to be very honest. Like, she was just the total wrong person to write that book. She was like, well, I'm short on time. I'm going to Europe in like 6 weeks, but let's see what we can get done. And really, when we think about it, it's like Douglass had the ability to write his narrative and to produce it in a way that became best-selling across the nation, where his name became a sort of household name by the mid-1840s, 50s. Tubman, she didn't have that. She was relegated to accepting the help of a woman, a white woman author who cared about the story but was probably unable. There was all kinds of sort of racially insensitive things, use of dialect, just all kinds of problems with her writing. However, in this, Bradford asks people to write on behalf of Tubman, and Douglass was one of them. And he does write this letter, and he says, look, I'm out here, I'm adored by hundreds of thousands of people who thank me every day. And the only thanks you get are in the shadows. You get the hugs, the prayers, the thank yous from the people you help flee from slavery. That's all you get. And so when we step back and we think about both of these warriors, Tubman was someone who preferred not to be in the spotlight, and that was the case with women's suffrage as well. She was a sort of we'll call her a sandwich generation. She was very sort of tight with the kind of white women abolitionists that we know from our history books, you know, the Lucretia Mott's, the Elizabeth Cady Stanton, those folks. And they helped her during very kind of difficult financial times. So she had a relationship with these folks. But it became a little difficult when the issue of women's suffrage appeared, in part because lots of these folks were very uncomfortable with the fact that black men were given the right to vote with the 15th Amendment before white women, right? So then there's some tension that hadn't existed prior to that. And Tubman figured out how to walk the line. She walked the line between these folks who had supported her and her crusade against slavery. But also, by the 1880s and 1890s, when we see the black club women movement begin, and these black women are standing up saying, hey, we need the right to vote too. And there was a very sort of tense and fraught relationship between white and black women suffragists.
And that still exists.
Indeed.
It still exists.
Indeed. When we think about sort of the political issues of today and how black and white women are able to collaborate with one another over specific kinds of issues, yeah, race sits at the center of some of those problems, those issues. And we see that in the late 19th and the early 20th century. Tubman was pretty much she was on her deathbed when we had the first major march in Washington for women's rights. And black women were not welcomed. They were basically told that if they came, they would have to march in the back of the line, right? And that was to appease white Southern women who were suffragists as well. And so we see right then, I mean, this is not Tubman, but I would argue that the black women who grew up knowing Tubman, learning about Tubman, took their cue from her and said, we will not. Someone like Ida B. Wells, who was in that march, she came with the Chicago delegation and she said, I'm going to march with my delegation or I'm not going to march at all. And so that's an example, I think, of how we see the intergenerational connection between the social justice activism of someone like a Tubman, who at that moment was literally on her deathbed, and to the generations who came up after her, witnessed what she was able to do pretty much on her own, and then took on that mantle themselves.
So we are broadcasting live, so I want to just reintroduce our panelists. You're listening to WURD Radio, 900 AM, 96.1 FM. We're broadcasting live from the Barnes Foundation. We are talking with Dr. C. James Trotman, founder of the Frederick Douglass Institute, and Dr. Erica Armstrong Dunbar, the biographer of the new book, She Came to Slay, The Life and Times of Harriet Tubman. And so, I wanna, there's like a lot that I wanna get to, and I know I wanna give everyone, an opportunity to ask, not everyone, but folks, I'm not gonna get crazy here. But I want you, Erica, to talk about, because there's a lot of mythology around Tubman. And I think part of it is because she could not write her own story. And so, you said, Dr. Troutman, that it was either 70 or 700 people she freed. But you break down very clearly who she was able to save and how she prioritized that. It was her people, it was her family. She went back time and time again to get her parents, to get her siblings. And so talk about that fortitude, that compulsion that allowed her to be free, but to keep going back and put herself in direct harm's way to get her people.
Yeah, I think when we break it down, the numbers, because everyone, well, how many people did she actually, set free or bring to freedom? The journey begins with her emancipation, right? When she makes the decision to flee from the eastern shore of Maryland in September of 1849. And she does this at first with her two brothers. And so I'm glad we're having the opportunity to talk, because the movie, of course, is out tonight, and there are some differences between the book and the movie.
I was going to ask you about that. How accurate is the movie?
Well, we can talk about that too. But she makes this decision along with her two brothers to escape. And she is very clear that she's probably going to be sold, that her owner had died, and the owner's wife was interested in making money, and the quickest way to do that was to sell some enslaved people. And so they made the decision to run in September of 1849, and at some point, a couple weeks in, her brothers got scared, and they were like, let's go back. They didn't have food, they were thirsty, they didn't know where they were going, no one was illiterate, no reading of signs or a compass or anything like that. And they said, we've left our families behind, let's go back. The punishment that we will surely face is better than the unknown. And Harriet says, no, I've left behind a husband, I've left my parents and my family as well, but there's nothing that makes me want to return. And they were like, too bad, and dragged her, literally dragged her back. So the beginning of her escape was sort of thwarted by her own brothers. And shortly after she returns and she hears the rumor she's going to be sold, and she says, forget it. At that moment, she kind of makes the decision, I'm never going to let a man decide where I'm going again. And she takes off alone.
That's like a serious, she's like for real. My life is about to,
y'all can wait around here, but I've got something to do. And so we know that in October, at some point in October, she leaves again, and she makes it to the border of Pennsylvania sometime, we think, in December, late November, December of 49. And it's almost immediately that she decides that she's going to go back for her friends and family. And she says she arrives at the border of Pennsylvania, and she was immediately feeling lonely, isolated. What did her freedom mean without her family and without her loved ones? What did her freedom, and I'm gonna use air quotes here for the radio listeners, I say freedom because we know that technically she was not free, right? That she had escaped. what did that mean, though, to live as a free person when her mother and father and siblings and husband were all back in Maryland? And it was almost instantly she decided, I'm going to go back for them. And this is where Philadelphia plays such a sort of instrumental part in Tubman's experience. She's here in Philly, she's raising money, she's working. And she's really doing the only work that's available for Black women in Philadelphia who are not literate in the 1840s and 50s. She's doing domestic work, right? She's washing clothes, she's a cook, she's working in hotels, she's working in people's homes here as well as in Cape May, New Jersey, and she's hustling to make money so that she can go back to bring her family and her friends. And her first trip is to actually Baltimore. It's not down to the Eastern Shore because she hears that her niece is going to be sold along with her children, and she shuttles herself to Baltimore, rescues her, and then kind of gets the gumption up to head back into the Eastern Shore for her husband. And
Keep going.
okay. So the movie has a very different version of kind of what happens between Tubman and Harriet Tubman and her husband, John Tubman. When she arrives on the Eastern Shore, she goes into hiding almost immediately. She'd been gone for about 18 months. And she gets word to John Tubman that she's there, and she wants to bring him, although he's free, she wants to help him, get up to Philadelphia to live with her. And he finds out, and he is unhappy. And he sends word back to her immediately. He refuses to see her. But he makes certain that she finds out that he found someone else.
Insult to injury.
That he married another woman, a free woman, and that any children they were to have together would be free, right? Unlike with Harriet. And so this was crushing, right? It was crushing. And in the film, there's a sort of a different, it's Hollywood. Hollywood does, and I actually think, there's something actually quite beautiful about showing the relationship, the struggles, the problems with unions, marriages under the institution of slavery. But in reality, she was sad, but then she was mad. And she says later on in her narrative that, she wanted to go into that cabin and turn it out. Like, she was ready to confront both John Tubman and the new John. And she's ready to do this. And then she realizes, wait, I can't bring any unwanted attention to myself. I'm a fugitive. I'm here. And so she swallows that. But what she does say is, if he could do without me, then I could do without him. Yeah. So she lets John Tubman go. And what she does do instead of that trip didn't go, it wasn't in vain. She rescues other people, right? She's like, and she realizes that she thought her mission was to go back to get John Tubman, but it wasn't that. That it was to go back and to rescue enslaved people. And so she would do this for at least 13 times between 1850 and 1860. She rescued between 60 and 70 people, all of her family members, with the exception of one sister who she was unable to. She went down to get her. It was on the fall of 1860. The world and the nation is spinning on its axis. This Civil War is about to begin. Lincoln's been elected. She heads down to Maryland and finds out that her sister Rachel had died. And it was her last sibling that she could rescue. And she tried to get Rachel's children, but they were on different farms. And she really saw that as her only real failure in her attempt to rescue her friends and family. But it was her homies, her people, that she went down to rescue. But her work in the Civil War, during the Combahee River Raid, she emancipates over 700 enslaved people. So, like, when we, in total, and we're not even talking about the folks who she helped with information, right, during the years, like, that lady in that house is gonna help you, they got a wagon, give them some money and whatever, they'll help you. We don't know how many people were helped by that information. But we know that Tubman, she emancipates almost 1,000 people. When we add the South Carolinians as well as her family and friends, it's upwards of it's close to 900 people. And when we step back and we think about that, like, who else did that? Who else did this? Like you said, small in stature, a woman of few words, but of great action.
That's Dr. Erica Armstrong Dunbar. She's the author of She Came to Slay, The Life and Times of Harriet Tubman. So I would be remiss, Jim, Dr. Troutman, if as a Black-owned media company, if we did not talk about Frederick Douglass as a Black media owner and journalist. And again, I mean, if you have not read Frederick Douglass's works, he was just the most beautiful writer. And to know that he was born enslaved and he, was self-taught, and I mean, it's just miraculous. It's just an amazing feat of how he became such a prolific writer and orator and all that. But I wanted to see if you could talk to us about the North Star newspaper, which he started. And I actually use this quote when I speak at places, because I think that this sums it all up about the power of Black ownership of media. He wrote, "We are now about to assume the management of the editorial department of a newspaper devoted to the cause of liberty, humanity, and progress. The position is one which, with the purest motives, we have long desired to occupy. It has long been our anxious wish to see in this slave-holding, slave-trading, and Negro-hating land a printing press and paper permanently established under the complete control and direction of the immediate victims of slavery and oppression." And to me, that is still true. It is ownership of media by Black people is absolutely critical so that we can tell our own stories. So talk to us about his role as a journalist and as a newspaper entrepreneur and founder.
Well, Douglass owned and wrote for 4 newspapers in his own time. The one that's most popular is the North Star. It came into being after he spent almost 2 years in the British Isles, because as many of you may know his history, he was forced to leave this country after the publication of the book that made him famous. That book is entitled The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. Now hold on to your seats. An American slave, not a Maryland slave, not an Eastern Shore slave, but an American slave. And then the last part of that title is equally as important, written by himself. We could have a seminar just on the title itself because it reverberates both historically then and also touches on us today. Because Douglass was courageous and truthful, and I want to underscore the truthful part of his personality, he named individuals in that book that made him famous, that also made him infamous. They were out to take him out because he embarrassed the powers that be at that time. And so they had a bounty out on him. When his abolitionist friends became aware of that, they said, well, we have to get you out of here. You just can't stay in the country anymore. And as most of you will understand, he said, well, okay, but first I need to talk to Anna about all of this, his wife. And he talked to her, told her what the circumstances were, and Anna was strong enough not only to understand, but to tell him that I will take care of home while you're away. And she did. And there's another part to that, but we can get into that maybe with the Q&A session. So Douglass spent nearly 2 years in the British Isles. He left here as to the British anyway, as a nobody. He had no special identity. By the time he came back in 1847, he was a rock star. He had spoken before thousands of people who were committed to anti-slavery. And by the way, let me add that this was a non-digital age. There were no microphones, no computers, no telephones, nothing. He spoke for hours until he became hoarse. But his passion was to explain to another culture in another time what the devastating cost of enslavement was to this country, and of course, through him to himself. I think it's also important to keep in mind that when he came back, he'd already developed the notion that I need to have my voice articulated. I appreciate William Lloyd Garrison and the Liberators and some of the other newspapers, but they're not articulating my voice. So he came back to the United States in Rochester and developed the North Star. The North Star was singularly the most important abolitionist paper eventually to cover his own time. And then, of course, there was Frederick Douglass's newspaper as a sequel to the North Star, and then Douglass's monthly, and then right after the Civil War, Douglass published what he thought would be the theme of the post-war generation, the new national era. But there are several larger points to be made here. If Douglass had had access to Twitter in his own time, he would be twittering more than you know who. He was fascinated with the new technology, and of course, newspapers were a part of that. He also loved photography, took an interest in photography. In part, it's one of the reasons why he is the most photographed American in the 19th century. But it really doesn't matter what the toy was or what the instrument was. Douglass was going to try. The North Star grows out of his instinct that what was being said may have been said fairly, clearly, compassionately, but the black person has to speak for him or herself.
Word. I couldn't resist.
I got it.
I couldn't resist.
And so that's just an overview of what Douglass did. But if you've read the North Star, and I want to back up 2 steps and say this. Everybody in here has got a phone. You can Google the North Star. You can Google Douglass's first narrative. And please try it. Taste his freedom. Because he was a master of words. The movie that has just come out, I think, provides you with maybe some context for looking at the beautiful movie-setting words that Douglass used to write the narrative that made him famous. each scene can be a scene out of a movie. And I can't tell you, but there have been lots of generations of important people from, not just important, but people who are familiar to you, from Nat King Cole to Harry Belafonte, who've wanted to make movies about Douglass. So the whole idea of Douglass and technology and the newspaper is about his instinctive understanding that nobody can speak for you but you. And that's what, that's what I think was his major contribution. Now, the North Star, bear in mind, is not the first African-American produced paper, but it was one of the earliest. And he made it clear that it addressed the issues of the day. And this is an area yet to be developed. Maybe there's a scholar out there who will do it. I'm retired. But nobody has written about extensively, comprehensively about Douglass's editorials. Just search and look for those editorials. They address all the issues of the day, and some of which overlap into our own. He wasn't exactly the best bookkeeper in the world, so he had trouble from time to time keeping his finances straight. And for that, for his ability to keep it going, it had everything to do with the Griffith, one of the women white women from the Anti-Slavery Society who helped him. Her name was Griffith. She came over and helped him to get his book straightened out, because without her, the North Star might have collapsed. And remember, there wasn't a mail system that he could use the way we use the mail system today. You had to go out and hustle. And one of the reasons that Douglass was at Seneca Falls, and you all remember Seneca Falls, the great 1848 convention in Seneca Falls, New York, where women got together, mostly white women, I think all white women, to tell you the truth. They got together to carve out the path for the right to vote. Douglass was one of the few males and the only black male there in support of their efforts. So when I said to you earlier that Douglass walked shoulder to shoulder with women, I meant that throughout his life. Now, there was a break, and it had everything to do with that 15th Amendment, but nevertheless, if you want to get a closer understanding of how Douglass felt about that, read the chapter in the third of his autobiographies entitled Honor to Whom Honor. And he lays out in that chapter not only the names of women who've supported him, but women who've taught him how to think about critical issues. So this technology was very much a part of Douglass's voice. He stayed with journalism because he knew that that was the avenue to make certain that his voice could and would be heard. And of course, by the time of the second, third, and fourth publications, Douglass was famous. And maybe we'll have an opportunity to talk about how he used his fame and technology before the evening is over.
Great. That's Dr. C. James Trotman, who is the founder of the Frederick Douglass Institute. And so I think we have some microphones that we're going to make available to people who have questions. Are the microphones okay, great. I just have one more question, and then we'll go to the audience. So we're going to keep these short because we want to get to the audience. So Tubman died in 1913, and Douglass died in 1895, correct? And so they went through, the Civil War. They went through enslavement, freedom or whatever, close to freedom. They went through the Civil War, and then they went through Reconstruction, and then they saw the backlash, and so I'm wondering, like, how did that affect them to have worked so tirelessly and so hard for freedom for Black people, and then to think that you got it after the Civil War, and then it's like, now, you have Obama, and then you got Trump, but you got, there's this whiplash, and I'm just wondering if you guys could speak to how they processed that. But let's start with you, Erica.
Yeah, I don't think that the generation of people who were born enslaved thought they had it after the Civil War. I don't think they ever slept one moment of their lives after the Civil War thinking that their freedom was secure. Once you live through that kind of institution, you always are sort of waiting for someone to take it from you again, to take your freedom. For Tubman, she witnessed and experienced, I'll keep it short, the nadir of race relations, right? She witnessed the rise of white nationalism at the end of the 19th century. And she was living in upstate New York, so she wasn't in the South. She was, like Douglas, she was in New York. She was always poor. She never had money. She struggled. She married after the war. This is one of the other things I love about Tubman. Like she married a man who was 20 years younger than she. Tubman had a tenderoni, and we don't often think about that, but she did. But he was a serviceman. He had fought in the Civil War as well. But they struggled, right? They basically collected garbage to sell, to feed their pigs. They had a farm. They never had enough, right? So I'm not certain that the sort of freedom that came after the war changed her life conditions. It really didn't. She struggled just as much, of course, without the overwhelming concern that she could be hauled back to Maryland and sold into the lower South. But she never really escaped the poverty that clung to the vestiges of slavery.
Dr. Trotman?
Have any of you been to Cedar Hill? You don't know what I'm talking about, do you? Okay. By contrast, Douglass did not die a poor man. He was a businessman and a banker. And in fact, he was chairperson of the Freedmen's Bank in Washington, D.C. His house in the Anacostia section of Washington, D.C. sits up on a hill. He broke the racial code that enabled him to buy it. The house was not cheap then. My guess is in the area of $7,000. My guess is that if it were on sale, it'd probably be $1 million plus or a couple of million. So Douglass did not die a poor man, but he was always a very generous man. And so he supported causes, his own children, and perhaps the most important thing about it was that during the Reconstruction period, Douglass, who had been an outsider, became an insider. And by being an insider, I'm talking about Douglass's role as sheriff to the District of Columbia, his ambassadorship to Haiti and to the Dominican Republic, and also his affiliation with the colleges in the area, particularly Howard University, where he served as a member of the Board of Trustees. Was he disturbed about the Reconstruction period? Absolutely. His last speech is in many ways a critical analysis of why the Civil War's outcome did not bring about the changes that he expected. The most important thing to remember about him was that while he was a defender of the Constitution and a patriot, he was a critical voice. There was no such thing as being free a little bit. We were either going to be free all the way or we were not going to be free at all. Does that help?
That's beautiful. Okay, time for the audience. So I think we have one right back here. Ashley? Yes. I know I've asked a lot of questions, but if you can keep your questions nice and tight, we'll get done.
Thank you
And if you can direct them to one person.
Thank you for the discussion. And I just wanted to raise, and y'all touched on it, November 13th, they'll be having a Supreme Court discussion around the civil rights legislation of 1866. And I wanted to know what y'all thought you can pull for us to think about now when they're talking about this particular question. Are we any longer a special class, protected class? Would Douglass or Harriet say today that we are no longer considered a protective class?
Who wants to take that? Go ahead, Dr. Troutman.
Well, Douglass did not believe that you could slice up democracy, that you were either a citizen and fully responsible for your citizenship, or you were not. So in Douglass's mind, these various moments in history where civil rights, no matter what the umbrella may be, if they carve up citizenship, to Douglass, that is indefensible. One has to remain committed to the constitutional rights that we all have.
We're going to take one from over here. Yes.
My question is, I was wondering if you could put yourself in the place of Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass today and tell us what they would think about reparations. Should it be something paid by Europeans, or should we as black people be paying reparations to ourselves, which is much more workable and realistic, I think?
Reparations.
I get to walk into that?
You get to walk into reparations. No, yeah, that's a good one.
Well, you know, Tubman took money from white people her whole life. She had to. There was no way she could actually support herself. And she understood that it was the vestiges of slavery that created that situation. That even after the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were passed, that she was still left picking up garbage off the streets, doing laundry, doing domestic work. And so, you know, although Tubman never commented on it publicly, you know, she didn't comment much on the political issues she talked about more frequently, of course, was anti-slavery, and then after the war, it was about women's rights to vote and the right for elderly black men and women to live and die with dignity, to have a place, to have resources, to care for them in their sort of the latter years of their lives. So she never spoke in the way that Douglass did, kind of on the issues of the day, the issues of the pressing issues. But we can look at the way she lived, and I think with reparations, I think she would have been okay with reparations, and she actually would have been, she understood that without some form of reparation, that she and people like her who transitioned out of slavery to freedom, that there was so little room for them to progress. If she hadn't had the friends that she did have, there's no way she would have had the home that she had in Auburn, New York. That home was given to her by a white politician. Literally, she was given food and wood. This was to keep her sustained. She didn't get a pension from the military until she was in her 70s. She had to fight for it. And so I say with reparations, Tubman would have said, yes, let's go.
Another question?
Okay. Good afternoon. I'm Olaniyan Adefumi, and I have a question for either one of you. When someone ran away from the plantation, he or she became free. Why are we holding on to that stupid word, freed slave? When you run away, you're not a slave.
Okay, Olaniyan, let's, well, I think Erica is a perfect person to answer that because her second book was all about freedom versus
I always use
enslavement.
I use air quotes when we say free, when we're talking about the 19th century, not just for people who were enslaved, but for free blacks who did not claim a direct connection to enslavement. Because I always ask the question, what is freedom if slavery still exists, right? How do these things function side by side? They really don't. Freedom doesn't really exist if you are constantly vulnerable. So when I have students who make the mistake of writing free slaves, I always say, what's a free slave? In the margins in red, what's a free slave? That doesn't even make, of course, and in my class, they don't say slave, they know to say enslaved person, right? And I think that's something, when we think about language, it's really important, especially now, so I'm glad you brought this question up. When we're raising a generation of folks who are on their phones all of the time, language has lost, in some ways, I think it loses its power when you're using your thumbs all of the time. And so I think it's important to correct students, to correct everybody when we think about the language we use to describe people who were formerly enslaved.
I think we can take like 2 more questions. Halana is right here. Ashley, can you give Halana the mic? Go ahead.
Okay. Hi, Sara. Beautiful job hosting today. Thank you so much. My question is, what are your thoughts on the online activism that a lot of millennials are participating in, using Instagram and Facebook and social media as a form of activism? And could you share with us perhaps even what, if you can, kind of imagine Harriet Tubman or Frederick Douglass would kind of say about the impact of using technology and social media as a forms of activism, especially for all the causes that we are kind of galvanizing for these days? Thank you.
Okay. I'm not online. But Douglass would be, and he would be all over it. And I think the most important thing about hypothesizing Douglass's role in online activity is to reassert a couple of things about his own personality. One is that he was a very precise and strategic thinker. So all of the loose lip stuff that takes place online would first of all be the focus of his criticism. What do you mean by this? What do you mean by that? And you have to be specific about it. And then one of the beautiful things about his mind is that he would demand that you explain how you got to where you are. And so much of that is not present in some of the horrible developments that take place. Now, to the extent that Instagram and all of that brings people together, when it does, I think it's the sort of thing that he would certainly support. But as a strategic thinker, and I include Tubman in that as well, that these strategic thinkers would demand precision. You have to know exactly what you mean, and if you're going to go public with your comments, then we need to know how you got there. And may I just offer one other quick response to this? The most famous speech that Douglass gave is entitled, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July?" if you haven't read it and read it again. If you have read it and somehow or another you're touchy about slavery, you don't like the word, or just insert your favorite oppressed group, the name of your favorite oppressed group, whether it's immigrants or whatever the case may be, people who are handicapped, and read that essay with your favorite oppressed group, not favorite in the sense that you approve of them, but the name that comes quickly to mind as you think about oppressed groups. And for Douglass, in his time, it was the enslaved. And the reason why the speech continues to last is because it is a template for how we should treat each other in a democracy. What we should remember about the beginnings of our democracy, what we should keep in mind as we are implementing it throughout our lives, and finally what it means, and this to me is so very critical. We are inheritors of the wonderful struggles that these two people went through in order for us to be where we are. If that helps. Okay.
Definitely. I think we have time for one more question. And yes.
Good evening. I liken Dr. Walter Lomax to Frederick Douglass because he's a media owner and also someone who's written his own autobiography, because his autobiography is still continuing to be written through Sara, through WURD, and us in this room, and those who are listening. I'm a student of history, and I just don't look at history through time periods or moments, but I look through the eyes of individuals and the courage. They give me courage to understand that we can do it today. And when you focus on individuals instead of situations, you'll understand that a lot of times situations draw out the courage in people. So I guess my question to you is, what situations today should draw out the courage that Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman had, and not just look at history as something in the past, but something that should inspire us and give us the courage to continue on the works in which they have started?
That's a great second to last question. So I'm going to ask the last question, but that's a great question. Bringing it forward.
Sure. I'm just going to jump in quickly, and I think that, at this moment, there's so many things. There's so many issues we could point to. So I'm not gonna go with, the most obvious down on Pennsylvania Avenue. I'm gonna go with the global crisis around our world, around our climate. And I'm thinking about someone like Tubman, who adored nature, right? She knew what herbs and sort of natural flora were used for medication, because enslaved people, of course, were not privy to that. And she enjoyed the outdoors. She enjoyed her environment. And I think that she would, if she were here today, and historians hate doing that. Like, what would they think today? We don't like doing that, but since you asked, I think she would think very deeply about the climate, about climate change. And ultimately, we can sit here and fight about X, Y, and Z, but if there's no planet left, then who cares?
Dr. Troutman?
I would go back to the 1845 narrative where Douglass adds to that story the betrayal that he faced when he wanted to escape. He was betrayed by fellow slaves. And he put it in there. He didn't have to put it in there. He could have just glorified himself and the people around him. But he put it in there to remind us, I think, that we need to take care of ourselves. And we have children, babies being shot in the street. And whatever the complex causes may be, we need to spend more time taking care of ourselves. Because if we don't, then this horrible epidemic of brutality and killing will continue to grow. And so I think that Douglass in our time would remind us of the need to take better care of ourselves and to become involved. And then my favorite four-letter word, vote.
Tuesday, y'all.
Vote.
Make sure you vote. Yeah. So wait, don't start clapping yet. And that was actually the perfect last question. It really was. But I just want to ask this last one. Okay, so this is the lightning round. This is like the rapid response. If there was one thing that you think has been overlooked, ignored, or distorted about Douglass and Tubman, what would that be? Dr. Troutman.
Well, when it comes to Douglass, it's that there is not enough of him in our public school curriculum. One. Number two, and this will sound slightly contradictory, you can't expect school systems to do for you what you need to do for yourself.
All right. Erica?
So read Douglass.
Read Douglass. Erica?
You know, I just hope that people, one of the things we don't think about with Tubman is sort of who she was as a woman, as a wife, as a mother, as a philanthropist, as a nurse, as a military leader. We don't think about her as a sort of complex person. She's an image, an icon that we think we know about. And I feel like we're in a moment right now, because of the film, because of the book coming out, because of the possibility of her appearing on a $20 bill, that we have a great opportunity to think about her as a person and what it meant to live through the darkest of days, to come out not unscathed, but still buoyed and ready to take on the next challenge and to leave for the next generation a set of footsteps to follow.
Which is an incredible model for us as Black people, as all people, to be inspired and to model. So that is wonderful. Thank you very much. We've got Dr. Erica Armstrong Dunbar, Dr. C. James Troutman. Thank you very much.